There we go. Now we're recording. Okay. So speaking of videos, if you're watching the video, in addition to sending in the attendance words, you'll also need to say or take a screenshot every time I say one of the attendance words, so you know how to get your points for watching the video. Any questions about participation slash attendance? All right. And again, to remind you, since this is changing things up a little bit, lab will be in person this week, unless you've already done it. So I'll go ahead and tell you, if you've done lab 10, because it is virtual, I think it's lab 10, doesn't matter. Anyway, if you do this week's lab, which is the Hardy Weinberg thing, about goldfish, if you do it and turn it in before it comes time for lab, then you don't need to come to lab. So that's up to you. And it is one of those more difficult ones, so that's why I want to give you the choice. If you want to do it on your own, then there's no need for you to come in. But if you don't want to do it on your own, and I wouldn't blame you for that, come in and we'll all do it together. So any questions about lab this week? Okay. Next week's lab is virtual. So you're just going to watch a video. It's really nice and easy. So we're obviously not going to meet for that. You can do it anytime you want. There's no pre-lab due on Friday. It's since the only bad thing about videos is, like with a regular lab, you can go back and correct your mistakes. With videos, you're just stuck with your grade that you get. So between now and then, I'm going to come up with some other videos. So you'll have the one video that you'll need to watch for the lab, but then there'll be other ones that you can watch for extra credit. Like, oh man, I didn't get full credit on the actual video. So then you can do these extra ones and then get the points back. So any questions about any of this? All right, does anybody have any of your own announcements or reminders? All right, let's do attendance. Excuse me, X out of this. And then we'll get started. All right, Brumfeld is not here. Champion is here. Gross is online, I think. Brody is here. Randall Hill is here. The other Hill is not. Jackson is not here. Keys is here. Perez is not here. Sigmund is here. Slaughter is not here. Smith is here. Stover is here. Tompkins is not here. The Nest is not here. Watson. Nope, I think Watson is online. Young is here. Schweibeck is not here. Lawrence is here. Wilson is here. Did I miss anybody? All right, nice and easy. So once again, to remind you, we are done with the material that's going to be on exam 3. So we are now moving towards the last portion of the semester. All the information we're learning from here on out is going to be on the final exam. And again, to remind you, the final exam will be in person. I think Monday at 8 a.m., but I'll definitely get back to you with the time and date. But it will be in person. It will be about 100 questions. About 150 of those questions are going to be from the first 3 exams, and about 50 of those questions are going to be about the material that you're learning now. So let's jump into it. We are covering now chapters 11 and 12. I've combined them. I'm sure you've noticed recently. This PowerPoint, like the other ones, is based on the old textbook. And the old textbook did it in a completely different order, and I think they did it in a better order, so I'm sticking with that. So again, if you're reading the textbook as you should be and following along, you might notice this is out of order and I'm using different examples, but that's okay. But now you know, and look out for it. So as always, the old textbook are like this. They have these little games, or not games, these little pictures, and they talk about like, hey, why does this matter, right? In this case, we're talking about evolution. So they're saying, hey, why does this matter? Can anybody even tell what this is a picture of?
Like a tiny tomato.
Yeah, it's a tiny tomato, probably just like a cherry tomato. But the point that the old textbook was getting out with that is that's what tomatoes used to look like. All of them. They didn't used to be big old tomatoes. We changed them. Humans changed them. Right? So when you see a tomato nowadays, those big ones like that, that's because humans made that happen. Same thing with broccoli and watermelons, all kinds of stuff. So the point here is this is an example of evolution, right? The fact that tomatoes, well, I mean, some of them still look like that, but the fact that we now have big tomatoes, that is an example of evolution. Specifically, evolution by artificial selection. So as you're going to learn in this chapter, there's different types of evolution, and that's just one of the types. Any idea what might be going on there? This is really surprised if anybody can guess this, because it is pretty vague. It has to do with evolution. Any idea? That's okay, I don't blame you. So, what they're getting at here is this guy has head lice, right? This kid's got head lice. It's a common thing for kids to get head lice. And what they're talking about, or the textbook, the old textbook, the point they were getting at with this is sometimes head lice can kind of become immune to the medicine that you put in there to kill them. And that is also an example of evolution, specifically natural selection. So sometimes human can cause evolution, right? We've caused evolution by making these basically super lice, where they don't, they can't be killed by the poison that you're putting in your hair. All right, how about this one? Obviously, those are cheetahs. Does anybody know what that might have anything to do with as far as evolution is concerned? What is it?
Genetics, maybe?
Yes, great guess, yes. Genetics, because as you're gonna learn in this chapter, there's something called a bottleneck effect. And what's happened with cheetahs twice in the history of their existence is they've nearly gone extinct twice. So because of that, they are genetically very similar. They don't have much genetic diversity. And you're gonna learn about what genetic diversity is in this chapter and why it's important. So anyway, not gonna be tested on that, but this is the kind of stuff we're gonna look at in this chapter. Again, this is a different order than your textbook. So for example, this is what we're gonna cover, right? We're gonna talk about the diversity of life, and we're talking about Charles Darwin, we're talking about evidence of evolution, we're talking about natural selection as one of the mechanisms of evolution, right? There's other ones too. Then we'll talk about the different types of evolution, and finally, we'll talk about the mechanisms of evolution. But notice here, we're starting off with the diversity of life, and according to your textbook, that would be chapter 12. So also, this is a good time to point this out. Again, we are covering chapters 11 and 12 right now, but if you'll notice, we skipped chapter 10. Chapter 10 is on WBSU Online. Obviously, it's in your textbook. You can read about that stuff, but you're not going to be tested on it. So we had skipped chapter 10. We did that on purpose. Anyway, any questions before we get started? All right, let's talk about the diversity of life. Oh yeah, attendance words. The first word for attendance will be sun, S-U-N. This for the first time in a long time, the sun was up when I got to work today. Very exciting. Sun is the first word for attendance. So if you're in person, take a note, and at sometime before 9 a.m., make sure you send that word with the rest of the words, along with one question based on the material covered in this chapter. Anyway, taxonomy is a word you might need to know. You definitely need to know it. You might be tested on it. Taxonomy is the branch of biology that deals with identifying, naming, and classifying species. So yeah, we're gonna talk a lot about taxonomy. I might ask you what it means. Probably not. I don't remember if there's a test question on that, but if there's not, I'm not gonna write it. Because I'm more interested in you knowing how taxonomy works than the definition of taxonomy. For example, I want you to be familiar with the Linnaean system. This is the method of naming species. Like Homo sapiens, for example, right? We are Homo sapiens. That's the name of our species for humans. Right? There's a method for naming them. It's also a hierarchical classification of species. It goes into broader and broader categories. For example, yes, we are humans, but if you get a little bit broader, we are primates. Get even more broad, we are mammals. Broaden it some more, we are vertebrates. Broaden it even more, and we are animals, right? Of course, I skipped a few, but that's the ones that we're all very familiar with. So any questions so far? All right, so let's talk about naming and classifying the diversity of life. First thing you need to know is the Linnaean system has a two-part name, and you're probably already familiar with this. Like I already said, we are called Homo sapiens, right? That's the name of humans. It's a two-part name, you probably already know that. It's called binomial, right? When we say it's a two-part name, it's a binomial. The part that you need to know that might get a little tricky for you is in the two-part name, the first part is always the genus, and that's always capitalized. And the second part is the species, and it's not capitalized. So for again, Homo sapiens, right? Homo would be the genus that we are in. Sapiens would be the species. The book example, the other textbook, not the one you have, is using these cats, right? Panthera is the genus that this big cat is in. we'll talk about the species here in a second. But you will definitely get a test question where I say something like, I give you the species name of something, I'm gonna make something up, and then I'll also give you the rest of the classification, like kingdom, phylum, class, order, all that stuff. And then I'm gonna ask you, after giving you that long list, I'll say, which one of those is the family? Which one of those is the class? Something like that. So to know that, again, you're gonna need to know that the first part is the genus, second part is the species. Any questions so far? All right, so again, the two parts together, that is the scientific name of the species. And in this case, for that leopard, it's Panthera pardus. No need to write that down, it's just an example. I'm not gonna ask you any questions about that leopard. But again, the first letter is capitalized, the first word, the genus, is capitalized, the second word is not. And the whole thing is in italics. So if you're typing a species name, you should hit the italics. Control I, right? Italicize it. If you're writing it by hand, you're supposed to underline it. Because that's not going to be an issue in this class. You don't ever write anything by hand, but now you know the right way to do it. So why do we even have this, right? Why even have the binomial system? Why not just say panther? What's wrong with saying panther, or excuse me, leopard in that case? So what's wrong with just saying humans, right? Let me ask you this. Speaking of which, oh, it's already up there. Whoops. Anyway, if you couldn't see this, that wasn't supposed to come up yet. I was going to ask you, what is this, right? So where I'm from, back in the day anyway, we used to call those dolphin, right? So when you go to the restaurant in the Keys in the late 90s or late 80s, you would see dolphin on the menu, and it was that. Obviously, some people didn't like that, so since then, they started calling it mahi-mahi. Of course, in other places, like Hawaii, where that name originated from, they've always called it that. But mahi-mahi is just another name for dolphin. In Spanish, it's dorado. In Japanese, it's shira. Right? So the point here is, this is why we have the Linnaean system. So there's no ambiguity. No matter where you go on Earth, even though there might be different local names like this, there's only one scientific name. So that way scientists can communicate with each other easier, right? There's only one scientific name for that fish. There's only one scientific name for humans. Only one scientific name for a cardinal, whatever you can think of. But anyway, that's the purpose. And again, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about mahi-mahi. Extra credit, though, if you want to bring me some mahi-mahi for lunch one day. Just kidding. I won't give you extra credit for that. That would be bribery. It would be nice, though. All right. So the Linnaeus system, or excuse me, Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, I didn't even mention that because it's not important as far as the exam is concerned, but when I say it's the Linnaean system, it's because there was a guy who came up with this, and this is what it was named after him. But he introduced this system into grouping species, like I said, into a hierarchy of categories. Like I said earlier, humans, Homo sapiens is the species, but we're also primates, we're also mammals, we're also vertebrates, we're also animals. We're also eukaryotes, right? So it gets broader and broader. And what you're going to need to know, and this is probably, I think, the hardest part for a lot of students, because it's memorization, and some people just aren't good at memorization. And normally, I don't even like memorization. I want you to think and figure things out, not just memorize stuff and regurgitate it. But this is one of those times when you do need to memorize stuff and regurgitate it. So it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. There's going to be another slide that shows you that. You're going to need to know them in that order, in both orders, right? You're going to need to know from broad to specific and from specific to broad. I'll just go ahead and show you the next slide. It might make it easier. All right, so you need to know, again, if you get specific, go from specific to broad, it's species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain. Of course, the other way around, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. This is also slightly, I don't want to say inaccurate, but it's an oversimplification. There are also things like subphylums and superclasses, things that we don't even get into in this course. Of course, your textbook might bring that up. But as far as the exam is concerned, we're going to go with this simplified version. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So there'll be probably a test question where I say which one of these is in the right order, right? So you get all of those, the multiple choice exam. You get all of those in different orders, and maybe only one of them will be in the correct order. Just make up, that's the right one. And there'll be a test question probably again where I would give you all this, for example. I might say something like, All right, so we have this Panthera pardus, and it is categorized as Panthera pardus, Felidae, Carnivora, Mammalia, Chordata, Animalia, Eukarya. Like I'll give you that whole list in the question, and then say, what phylum is it in, right? So you will get all that information, except it won't say domain Eukarya. It'll just say Eukarya. It'll say Animalia, so it won't say kingdom Animalia. It'll just say Animalia, right? So you're going to get a list like that, and I'll ask you, what's the family, what's the class, what's the order, something like that. Of course, it's not going to be this cat, so there's nothing to memorize here. You're going to get a species, presumably you've never heard before. I'm going to give you all that information. Then you'll need to be able to determine, kingdom, phylum, class, order, one of those things. So any questions about that example, or what's going to be expected of you in the exam? Okay, here's a different picture from a different textbook, a third textbook, so not the one you're using, not the old textbook, but this is a really great, I think it's a great picture because it shows you this very specific species of squirrel. And then you go up and look at the genus, right? So there's different genuses. All squirrels are not the same species. Then you go up in family. So then you have things that also include like chipmunks, right? Then you go up to the order, and that's all rodents, right? So mice, rats, all of them. Then you go up to class, and finally, and this is just an example, so there's no need to be taking notes or anything, but class is an interesting one for us because that's where we are related to squirrels in this example, right? Because we are in the same class. We are mammals. Like everything else beyond that, we're not related. So we're not in the same, family, genus, or species. Anyway, any questions about that example? All right, the next word for attendance. Well, it's not really a word at all, because today is National Housewife Day. So for the next word, give me the name of a housewife, fictional or otherwise. I guess if you can't think of one, that's fine too. You can just write, I can't think of the name of a housewife. Anyway, yeah, happy National Housewives Day. Anyway, the old textbook does point out that throughout history, this criteria used to classify and name species has ultimately been arbitrary, meaning like just scientists have come together and decided this, right? So yeah, they had guidelines, but at the end of the day, it was arbitrary because it was just decisions made by humans, right? So they say, oh, all these things have vertebrates, so we're going to put them in this category. All these things have hair, so we're going to put them in that category. All these things, I don't know, have a shell, so we're going to put them in this category, right? Ultimately, it was arbitrary. But after you learn about the processes by which the diversity of life has evolved, which is what we're going to get into here shortly, then we'll introduce this classification system based on an understanding of evolutionary relationships. In other words, ultimately, again, historically, it's all been pretty arbitrary. But as we're learning more and more about evolution, and realizing that, okay, this thing descended from this thing and this thing and this thing, and these two things have a common ancestor. So it's becoming less arbitrary. Now it's less arbitrary because now that classification that we just looked at, that is now based on evolutionary relationships. So if you download this PowerPoint, you can click on that and watch a little video about taxonomy if you want. Any questions so far? All right, here's a term you need to know. We're going to use it a lot in the next few chapters, probably, let me think, almost towards the end of the semester. So you need to know what this is. A species. A species is a group of actually or potentially interbreeding individuals. So, for example, a gray squirrel, right? We have gray squirrels on our campus. That is, they're all a species. Of course, there's other gray squirrels where my sister lives in Georgia. Same species. They're not breeding, but they could potentially breed. If we were putting them together, they could breed and create fertile offspring. That's another thing. It's not on there. Oh, it is on there. Okay. So yeah, when I say interbreeding, that also means they have to produce fertile offspring. So for example, does anybody know what you call it when you get mix a tiger and a lion?
A liger.
A liger, yeah. A liger is one of them. There's another one, depending on male or female. But anyway, yeah, liger. So tigers and lions are different species. They produce offspring, but ligers are not fertile, right? Ligers cannot reproduce. Same thing, does anybody know what happens when you mix a donkey and a horse? What do you get with that? Yeah, a mule. And mules cannot reproduce. So are there any questions about what makes up a species? All right, so that's the rule. There are exceptions. You can look up those exceptions for extra credit if you want. You don't need to know them. So as a matter of fact, I wouldn't ask that for your one question when you send in the attendance words. Don't ask what the exception. You're not going to get in trouble or anything, but I wouldn't ask what the exceptions are. My response will be, you don't need to know that. Feel free to look it up for extra credit. Anyway, yeah, that's a species. Not to be confused with population. We'll get to that later. Just keep that in the back of your mind. When you just think of species, and right now that seems like an easy thing to remember. But then once we start talking about population, and we start talking about a community, maybe an ecosystem, then things start getting a little bit trickier. But for now, it's pretty simple, right? Any questions about what the species is? All right, so that brings us to another term, speciation. This is the formation of two species from one original species, right? So you have one ancestral species, and eventually, because of evolution, sometimes they just turn into different species. And there's different types, and you're going to need to know the different types of speciation. One of them is called allopatric speciation. And this involves a geographic separation of populations. Which basically what you're saying here is they're just, because of something geographical, they've been separated. And because of that, they become different. That's one type. And that's basically it, right? And I'll go on and describe this a little bit more. For now, that's it. And then the other type is sympatric speciation. This is speciation within a parent species while remaining in one location. So basically, again, allopatric speciation, they become separated and they become different because of that. Sympatric speciation, they just happen to become separated, but they do become different. And we'll talk both about them. We'll talk about them both separately. So that's just the introduction. All right. So here's an example, and this is one that I made up. And then I'll give you a real. Or is this one I made up, or is this one? No, yeah. This is a hypothetical example, right? This isn't a real one. But I don't know if you're really familiar with what. I don't know if you've ever been out west, but this is the Seattle area. I know it might be hard to see, but you've got the Pacific Ocean, and then you have this huge mountain range, right? And then it's flat over there. Does anybody know what caused those mountains? Like what created those mountains? Does anybody know? Not that I expect you to. I'm just curious. And that picture is a hint. Not that I expect anybody to really understand what that picture means either. But does anybody know what caused those mountains? The Olympic Mountains and the Cascade Mountains. Any idea? You're on the right track because actually, the thing that caused those mountains also causes earthquakes. What's happened is there's these plates in the Pacific Ocean that are crashing into the North American plate, and that has caused the mountains to rise. Same as the Appalachian Mountains, right? That used to be our situation. They used to be big. They used to be the biggest mountains in the world. But anyway, imagine before this happened, it was nice and flat. So imagine if you just had a species of, some kind of deer, and they lived in this whole area, right? And then this happens, and now you got this big mountain range between you. And now, and I don't know, I chose this area for a reason, and I don't know how familiar you are with Seattle, but when you think of Seattle weather, what do you think of? I'm curious if anybody knows.
Rain.
Yeah, it's rainy, right? It's rainy, it's gloomy. The reason for that, not that you need to know this, is because of these big mountains. You get all this weather coming in from the Pacific Ocean, and then it can't get up over those mountains. It tries, and once all that moisture and stuff gets up really high, the atmosphere can't hold it anymore, so it rains. So that's why it's really wet in Seattle. However, it's basically a desert on the other side of the mountain. So I guess my point here is, imagine again some hypothetical species that used to live there, and then all of a sudden this big mountain comes up. That's not going to be all of a sudden. It will take millions of years. But anyway, so now you've got individuals on this side in the desert, and then you have individuals right here where it's just raining all the time. Ooh, a better example, forget the deer. Let's talk about a plant, right? Imagine there's some tree species that used to live in this whole area. And again, mountains pop up. Now it's really dry over here, really wet over here. Obviously, that's really different conditions. So those trees, that one species of trees would now be in different conditions and eventually probably evolve enough to where they're different species. Does that make sense? So because of allopatric speciation, or because they were separated geographically, they're now in different areas, different conditions, and therefore they've evolved differently. Make sense? All right. Anyway, that's one type. Then, and again, still talking about allopatric speciation here. Within allopatric speciation, there's something called adaptive radiation. And this is where the population of one species disperses throughout an area. I guess I could use the same example that I just talked about with Seattle. Maybe a bird would be a good example. Maybe a bird that's not, not really good enough to fly over a mountain, maybe. No, we'll say that they are. So that could be an example. Imagine there was a bird species in the Seattle area, and one of them lives on the rainy side, and some of them made it over the mountain to the desert side. Not a lot, because the mountain's big enough to stop most of them from going over, but not all of them. So now you've got a few individuals on the desert side, you got some individuals on the rainy side, and again, eventually they could turn into different species because they're in different environments. So, any questions about that? All right, so those are all hypothetical. Eventually, I'm going to give you some real examples, and you might need to know those examples, but yeah, for now, we'll just leave it for those hypotheticals. So, what can happen here? How do they become different? Well, one of the ways they can become different, like big changes, will be chromosomal errors during meiosis, or the formation of a hybrid that has too many chromosomes. So usually, especially within mammals, that could be bad. If you have too many chromosomes, as you know from lab, that can often lead to disorders with humans. But for some species, especially things like plants, sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing. And sometimes that just creates a new species. So sometimes that's how a species can be created. So it's not all, I guess the point here is, again, we talked about that geographical difference, with that allopatric speciation. And then this is a different type. This is like, all right, well, we have these individuals that are together. They're not separated geographically, but sometimes things go wrong. And because of that, you might just accidentally come up with a new species. I'm going to try to find some more videos. I think I may have shared one with you guys. If I haven't, I'm going to. It talks about like the genes involved in this and how, for example, they took the gene for eyeballs and fruit flies and put them on. They rearranged it, and then they ended up having the flies had eyeballs on their legs instead of where they should be, because the scientists did that because they figured out how the genes work. But anyway, I'm not going to get that technical. But if I can find that video, I'll share it with you if I haven't already. Anyway, any questions about sympatric speciation, or for that matter, allopatric speciation, since we're done with that? So your textbook, this is from your textbook, not the old textbook, does give an example of sympatric speciation. I'm not going to ask you about this example, but you can read all about it in the textbook. But there's these two different species. They used to be the same species. They live in the same lake, so that's why it's sympatric speciation as opposed to allopatric speciation. But because of the different conditions in the same lake, one species is turned into two. As a matter of fact, I wrote myself a note. I'll go ahead and just read it. Bear with me. Sorry, but I hate reading off things, but that's what I'm going to do. These fish are from a place called Lake Apohuica, if I'm pronouncing that right, in Nicaragua, and they show evidence of sympatric speciation. This is a crater lake. It's 1,800 years old. The genetic evidence indicates that the lake was populated by only 100 years ago by one population of fish. So only 100 years ago, there was only one species. And then since then, there's been two. Anyway, again, they're in the same lake, but of course, as you can imagine, especially a crater lake, which means it's probably pretty deep, there's going to be different environments, right? There's going to be like a shallow water environment, deep water environment. So because of that, this one species, within 100 years, has turned into two species. So they looked at the genetics. They are confirmed two different species now. But again, they used to be one species. That's just an example. I'm not going to ask any questions. For extra credit, you can look up other examples, right? Find me some examples of sympatric speciation. Find me some examples of allopatric speciation. And again, if you do that for extra credit, don't forget to include the link to your source to get your points. That's it as far as speciation is concerned. Any questions about speciation? Okay. The next word for attendance, again, not necessarily a word, but today is National Sandwich Day. So tell me your favorite sandwich, or the last sandwich you ate. Or if you don't like sandwiches, tell me that. And of course, we just bring it all together, and you guys can bring me a mahi-mahi sandwich. But no, I can't bribe you with extra credit. Anyway, let's talk about explaining the diversity of life. Right? So the explanation of the origin of the diversity of life is an evolutionary theory that was proposed by Charles Darwin. You need to know that, right? Charles Darwin is the one who first came up with this, or at least credited with it. There was another person too, we'll talk about him later. Actually, there's a lot of people. There's some other people that had some ideas. Their ideas weren't correct, but we'll talk about them. And then there was someone else who had a similar idea as Darwin at the same time as Darwin, and we'll talk about that later too. But yeah, we're going to give Darwin credit here. His book is called On the Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection. At least that's the famous book that we're talking about. He's written other books, but that's the big one. You don't need to know that. I'm not going to test you, or I'm not going to ask you questions about the name of his book. I'm not going to ask you when it was published. But before we talk about what he figured out, it's kind of like give the history of what people used to think, right? So let's talk about the origins, what people used to think. So here we go. The idea of fixed species. So back in the day, there was a Greek guy named Aristotle. Of course, your book mentions Plato, I think in addition to Aristotle. But anyway, these Greeks, these philosophers, thought that species were fixed forms, right? He thought the species never changed. So when they looked at species increase, right, when they were looking at life, they thought, all right, this is the way it is. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it always will be, right? Things do not change. That was the idea of these Greek philosophers. And then the Judeo-Christian culture also reinforces this idea, right? If you have a literal translation, like if you take the Bible literally, right, Genesis, then that's just it, right? The species were created that way, right? If you take it literally. So that's what we used to think, right? And if you click, I know this looks like pictures, but if you download the PowerPoint, you click a picture of Aristotle, you watch a little video that talks about the idea of, his idea. And of course, if you click the Bible over there, it'll show you a little video that talks about the biblical idea of origins. And of course, there's a lot of other ones, right? You think about, especially if we're talking about religion, right? There's a lot of religious stories about how life came to be. One of the criticisms I sometimes see about college in general is like, oh, we're trying to brainwash you, right? We're trying to indoctrinate you. So I'm not gonna tell you that you need to believe what I'm telling you, but you need to know it for the exam. What was I getting at? Oh yeah. So yeah, one of the criticisms, especially in this chapter, this is like one of the few controversial chapters there are. Some people are like, well, why don't you teach the other versions? Now, the point here is that I'm trying to make is there's so many other ones to teach you. There's a lot of other ideas, and we just don't have time to talk about all of them. This is not a class about the origins of life, right? This is a chapter about the origins of life. So because of time constraints, and because of the fact this is a science class, we're only going to talk about evolution, right? We're not going to talk about the other versions, and that's why. And as a matter of fact, we're barely even going to cover evolution. So there's classes, like if you're a biology major, there's a whole class based on this one chapter when you really dig into evolution, right? So this is just scratching the surface. Anyway, so moving on, this is what we used to think. Some people still do. But in the 1600s, religious scholars estimated the world was about 6,000 years old. So that was, and again, some people still think that. We have science that shows otherwise. We have evidence that shows otherwise. But yeah, again, this is where we're progressing as a species, humans, as we've learned, right? That was in the 1600s. So this idea that all living species came into being relatively recently and are unchanging, dominated for centuries. And again, for some people, it still does, right? But in the 1600s, again, back when they thought the Earth was only 6,000 years old, we had people still finding fossils, right? Or not still, they were finding fossils. And this was probably really weird to them, because again, they think the world is only 6,000 years old. They think species have never changed. They think there's been no new species, no extinctions, right? So when they look at all the life on Earth, that's the way it is now, that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it always will be. So these fossils were really confusing to them. Here's an example. They had one that they called it a snake stone, right? They called these a snake stone because to them, it looked like a snake. But what they couldn't figure out is why they never had heads. Because in their mind, again, it had to have been a snake, right? Because that creature that they're looking at, they've never seen anything like it in modern times. And in their mind, nothing's ever gone extinct. So that thing has to be some kind of species that's currently living, but they just couldn't figure out why they never had their heads. right? So then that's when things started to change a little bit scientifically. Then people started thinking, well, hold on now, maybe there were other species. Maybe there used to be this life forms that used to exist that no longer exist. So we had these discoveries in the early 1800s, including fossils of gigantic sea creatures like this thing right here, this Ichthyosaurus, which basically means fish lizard. And at that point, that's when like people really started saying, okay, look at this thing. Never seen anything alive like this. So clearly there have been some species that used to exist that no longer exist, right? So now around the 1800s, the scientific community finally started coming to the realization, yes, there have been extinctions. By the way, just to reiterate, this is just examples. I'm not going to ask you these dates. I'm not going to ask you about the Ichthyosaurus or the snake stone. I'm just kind of giving you the story of what we figured out and the timeline in which it happened. So any questions so far? All right, let's keep going with this timeline. Let's talk about this guy named Lamarck. There might be a question about Lamarck, maybe one question. So keep that in mind as I'm talking about him. So again, we're talking about kind of the 1800s. Scientists have now come to realize that maybe things have gone extinct, right? So that's where we're getting. And once they figure that out, right now they're looking at these fossils and they're looking at these things that no longer exist. And they're noticing, right? They're comparing and contrasting. Like, all right, these things that no longer exist are similar to these living things in this way, but different in that way, right? They're comparing and contrasting. So then in the early 1800s, this guy, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, suggested that the best explanation for these observations is that life evolves. So Lamarck is the first person to suggest evolution. Now I know I said earlier it's Charles Darwin. We're giving him the credit because he's the one who figured it out correctly, and I'll get to that in a second. But technically, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, or just Lamarck, he's the one who first said, you know what? Obviously life changed. We're looking at these fossils. These things are definitely not alive anymore, but they're clearly related to these living things. We can see how they're similar. We can see how they're different. So clearly, life must have evolved. It must have changed. So he proposed, and this is wrong. Again, his proposal was wrong. Keep that in mind. His proposal was that evolution is a refinement of traits that equip an organism to perform successfully in their environments. That part is mostly true. We'll talk about that later when we talk about natural selection. But the second bullet point, that's where he went wrong. By using or not using body parts, an individual may develop certain traits that passes on to the offspring. Right? So in his mind, I think the famous example is giraffes. He thought that they got a long neck because they're constantly stretching to get those leaves to eat, which is true. They are constantly stretching to get the leaves to eat. So he thought if they're stretching their whole life, stretching to eat leaves, and when they have offspring, because they've been stretching their neck their whole life, that their offspring would have slightly longer necks, and they'd be stretching their necks. And because of that, their offspring would have longer necks, so on and so forth, right? So that's what he thought. We now know that's not true. It's not by using it or not using it that you pass it along. But that was his idea, and that was the first idea of evolution, right? So for a while there, people said, yeah, sure, that's how it works. So again, his idea that life evolves was correct. His idea of how species evolve was mistaken. So I'm gonna put that in bold, put a little star there, just to remind you, like I said before I got into this, that second bullet point is incorrect, right? He was wrong. So I don't want you, when you're studying, thinking that's how that works. That's just an example of what he thought and what the scientific community thought a little bit. So his proposal that his proposal that species evolve as a result of their interactions between organisms and their environments did help set the stage for Darwin. So it's not like this guy was completely off. Like I said, this first bullet point pretty much nailed it, right? It's all about how these organisms, these individuals are interacting with their environment. That did have something to do with it. So Charles Darwin kind of like used what he came up with and used it, right? Standing on the shoulder of giants, that's what they say. So let's talk about Charles Darwin. Finally get into it. Charles Darwin, let me say, yep. So this is just some information, this little background information. I'm not going to ask you any of this stuff that's on the slide, but really quickly, we'll talk about him. So he was born in 1809. He has the same birthday as Abraham Lincoln, like literally the same day, same year. He was fascinated with nature as a boy, which kind of explains why he figured out what he figured out. He was in medical school for a while, so he wanted to be a doctor. But, he didn't have the stomach for it. You gotta imagine medicine was a lot different back then because you didn't have things like, you couldn't knock people out or, put them under to do surgery. So it just grossed him out, right? He couldn't handle it, so he quit medical school. To me, this is where it becomes interesting. He then studied to be a clergyman. And I love that because, I think I would say most people who don't agree with evolution do that from a religious point of view. And that's interesting to me because, again, he studied to be a clergyman. So it's not like he just didn't know the Bible. He studied it, right? So he also, that should goes to point out too, he wasn't doing this to be like spitting in the face of God. And he wasn't an atheist. He just figured this out. This is the stuff he figured out despite knowing about his religion. So anyway, at the age of 22, he began a voyage on the HMS Beagle, and that helped him frame his theory of the evolution. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But are there any questions so far? And again, that's a very unimportant slide as far as the exam is concerned. All right, so let's talk about his journey when he was 22, when he went on the Beagle. The Beagle was a survey ship that was charting the South American coast amongst many other stuff, other places. I'm not going to ask you that. That's also not important for the exam. I'm just setting the scene here. When he was on the Beagle, they forgot their iPhone chargers, right? So he had nothing to do when he was on shore. So for that reason, he went exploring. He was collecting fossils and living plants and even living animals. I'm gonna put a little star there. What is that? Your book specifically describes his observations of yeah. So yeah, he collected animals, and your book does give a specific example. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But yeah, he kept detailed journals of his observations. He was noting the characteristics of plants and animals that made them well suited for these environments. Because he's from England, and it's not like it was back in the day. Obviously, I was making a joke about the iPhone thing, but they didn't have TVs, right? So when he's seeing these are places he's never seen before. Maybe he had seen some of them in books where people had illustrations of them, but again, there was no cameras, so he'd never seen like even a photograph of these things. So this is very big information, right? Important information that he was writing down. And again, here's the example. He was observing ground finches. These are actually drawings that he's done. So just an example, and I only brought it up because your book's going to talk about it. So if you're reading your textbook, they'll bring that up. And I just want to point out, again, this is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about the ground finches, or I'm not going to ask you any questions about what he did on his off time. Again, I'm just kind of setting the stage so you can understand his frame of mind. Like, how did he get to this point? But anyway, any questions so far? Here's a little map, again, very unimportant, but as far as the exam is concerned, it just shows the path they went, right? They went around the world. What's interesting to me, and this is really trivial, has nothing to do with this class at all, but just want to point this out. I find it interesting that they went on the south side of Australia, but Darwin, Australia is up here. So I don't know how that happened. Darwin is in the Northern Territory. I don't understand it. Anyway, what is important about this picture, and we're going to come back to it later, is these islands. Right? The Galapagos Islands is really where it all happened. And the fact that they're this far away from South America is important. We'll talk about that in more detail. So the shape, the size, the distance, all that is very important when I start explaining evolution. And again, we've already talked about allopatric speciation. So that concept is going to come back, right? So we know what allopatric speciation is. I just taught you, but he didn't at the time. And the stuff we're going to talk about is going to be a lot about allopatric speciation. Just think about it. You got these islands, right? These islands are far enough away from South America that, or how do I put it? The perfect distance from South America where some things could leave South America and make it to the islands, right? It's not impossible for it to happen, but it's far enough away to where it doesn't happen often, right? So you may get some species of birds, like those finches that I was talking about, that maybe got caught up in a storm and flew out away from South America and found themselves on that island, right? So they were there, and now they're separate from the original species, right? The original population of birds that were on South America, right? They've now become separated. So again, we'll talk about that in more detail. And of course, this is a zoomed in picture. The fact that they're apart from each other is also important. Of course, maybe not for finches, right? A bird could fly from this island to this island to this island. But we're going to talk about some other species, like, for example, turtles. If you're a big old turtle, and you're living on this island, you can't make your way to this island, right? I'm not talking about sea turtles. I'm talking about big old land-dwelling turtles. So that will be important when we come back to it. So let's talk about his observations. His observations indicated that geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships among organisms and similarities of environment. That's a very important bullet point. Slow down and make sure you understand that one. There'll probably be a test question about that. So he's saying that, when he's looking at these species that are on the islands, for example, versus on the mainland of South America, they were closely related. He could tell they were closely related. Meanwhile, if looking at the mainland of South America, he might all right, here's a jungle, right? And here's all these things living in these jungles. And then he thinks back to the other places he's been, right? I showed you that map where they went around the world. He's thinking back or looking at his observations. So it's not just all about memory. But anyway, he's comparing and contrasting, right? So he sees these things in the jungle of South America. Then he sees these things in the jungles of elsewhere. And they're not even closely, you can tell they're not closely related. They're completely different, despite having the same environment. But again, comparing the same animals or plants or whatever it may be in South America versus the ones on the Galapagos Islands, they have different environments, but they were obviously more closely related. You could tell they were related despite having different environments. So that's an important bullet point right there. Geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships among organisms and similarity of environment. Of course, the example I gave was jungles, but as you can see here in this bullet point, the example that your old textbook gave, and maybe your current textbook, gave the examples of the temperate regions of South America. But whatever, the idea is still the same, right? So he went around the world, again, and saw all these different organisms and noted, if they're in similar areas or close to each other, that they're going to be more closely related than if they're in almost identical environments that are far apart. Any questions about that? Another thing to note, this is a good place to stop it too, is again, he wasn't just looking at living animals, he was also looking at fossils. So the South American fossils that he found were clearly examples of species that were different from the living ones. Like you could tell by looking at them, this animal does not exist anymore. But you can also tell by looking at them that they were closely related to the ones that were living. For example, if you look at these pictures, you probably recognize, or at least think you recognize, some of those animals, if not all of them. But none of those are living animals. So that thing that looks like a llama, that's not, right? There was a fossil of the thing that looked like a llama, but technically wasn't a llama. And all the, toucans, things like that, capybaras. But anyway, that's where we'll end it. Don't forget, when you send the words, to also send one question about the material covered in this lecture. And I will be in my office and online until 10 a.m. for office hours at the beginning. You guys have a good week.